This is Hong Kong. It's vertical, crowded, and never sleeps. It looks a lot like New York, and in many ways is the Asian version of it, being the top financial hub in Asia and third best in the world. It's been shaped less by the vision of mainland China and more by what was built by those who fled it. But how did it end up like this? How did an isolated fishing port that's been caught in a tug-of-war between the East and West for over a century become so powerful? Well, contrary to popular belief, it doesn't begin with Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, after 99 years of British rule, but rather centuries earlier, back in the 18th century, when the East India Trading Company first docked its ships in China, they found a market overflowing with goods the West desired: silk, porcelain, spices. But there was one thing the British loved more than anything else: tea. China became the major supplier of tea to Britain. And back home, the British couldn't get enough of it, even making it their national drink. But that obsession came with a cost. You see, in 1770, Britain accounted for 33% of China's total tea exports, and by 1801, that number had risen to 80%. The only problem was, Britain didn't have anything China wanted in return. With this came a new kind of trade dynamic. At first, the arrangement seemed simple enough. In exchange for tea, the Chinese emperor required pure silver bullion, which is basically solid coins or bars. At first, Britain was on board with this deal, but soon the British treasury began to run dry. Eventually, their lack of silver became a national crisis, and their solution to the trade imbalance was opium, a highly addictive narcotic that's illegal in China. Britain began growing it in its Indian colonies and smuggling it into Chinese ports. There, opium was exchanged for silver, which Britain then used to buy tea. And for a while, this illegal trade worked, at least until the Chinese government caught on. Silver was draining from the economy, and opium addiction was spreading rapidly throughout its population. So as a result, the government cracked down hard, and in 1839, it seized over 20,000 chests of opium and dumped them into the sea. Now, this obviously didn't sit well with Britain. And at the same time, they were getting more and more frustrated by the rigid structure of Chinese trade. All foreign trade had to go through a small group of approved intermediaries, known as the Hong merchants. Trade was confined to the port of Canton, now known as Guangzhou, located just upriver from Hong Kong. All of this growing tension made Britain fear they were losing control of their trade in the East. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade in China, issued an ultimatum. If Britain wasn't allowed to trade on its own terms, British ships would open fire. This marked the beginning of the Opium Wars, and it would become one of the most consequential power struggles in imperial history, shaping the fate of Hong Kong for the next 150 years. It was split into two parts. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with a British victory and the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. As part of the agreement, China conceded the rocky island of Hong Kong to Britain, allowed free trade with any merchants in China, and paid damages for the destroyed opium. But Britain still wasn't satisfied. See, they wanted to legalize the opium trade and have absolutely unrestricted access to all Chinese markets. So in 1856, the Second Opium War broke out. And once again, China was defeated. This time, the Treaty of Tientsin granted Britain even more land, including the area just north of Hong Kong Island known as Kowloon. The land may have been mountainous with very little flat ground for development, but Victoria Harbour was perfect. It offered a deep, naturally sheltered harbour, directly connected to Chinese trade routes along the Pearl River. For the British, it provided a secure gateway to mainland China, a launch point for trade across Asia, and a base for projecting naval power. It was one of the best natural harbours on the entire South China coast. The final expansion of British Hong Kong came in 1898. This was the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory, a lease agreement that gave Britain control of the land north of Kowloon, now known as the New Territories, and thus making up all the land of modern-day Hong Kong. But buried in the small print of the agreement was a crucial detail. They could only have it for 99 years. Now from here, this is where we get to the two things that changed everything for Hong Kong as a city forever. The first was the 1937 Sino-Japanese War, often considered the beginning of World War II in Asia. Thousands of Chinese refugees fled south to Hong Kong, pushing the population from just under 1 million to over 1.6 million within 4 years. But then, on December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded Hong Kong. Many citizens were imprisoned, and most had limited access to food and other resources. By the time the British returned at the end of the war in August 1945, the population had been reduced to around 600,000. The second came just 4 years later, with the Communist Revolution in 1949. As violence and political upheaval swept the mainland, many fled in secret, slipping across the border into Hong Kong. At its peak, as many as 100,000 refugees were arriving each month. By 1951, the population had exploded from 600,000 to 2.1 million. Two waves of mass immigration, almost back-to-back, had pushed Hong Kong to its limits. There was simply too many people and not enough land. But this is where things get interesting, because that population boom became the very thing that drove its transformation. Let me explain. By the early 1950s, over 300,000 people were living in squatter huts scattered across the hills of Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula. These makeshift homes, built from wood, scrap metal, and anything else people could find, offered a temporary solution to the population growth crisis. But they were dangerous. Crowded shelters, narrow alleys, and open flames made the settlements especially vulnerable to fire. But there was nowhere else for the people who lived there to go. Everyone knew that the lack of land was a disaster, until one day when the problem sort of solved itself. Christmas Day, 1953. A bucket of molten rubber was accidentally knocked over in the squatter settlement of Shek Kip Mei. Within minutes, flames spread through the maze of wooden huts. By the end of the day, 2 people were dead and over 53,000 were left homeless. Everything was gone, which meant there was essentially a blank slate, and the government decided that if they had to rebuild the homes, then they may as well build them upwards. So they did. The following year, a resettlement department was launched with the aim of clearing the old squatter settlements and replacing them with a more permanent, state-led housing solution. This marked the beginning of a vertical city. Standardized H-block apartment towers, named for their distinctive shape, became the blueprint for high-density, low-cost housing. These H-blocks were designed to be built fast, efficient to manage, and maximize land use, while providing basic shelter for low-income families, elderly residents, and migrants entering the workforce. They were essentially stacks of bare-bones, single-room units, often with shared corridors and communal bathrooms. Public housing then became not just a response to the crisis, but a key planning tool uniquely adapted to Hong Kong's demographic pressures and spatial limitations. With this infrastructure in place, the city was finally in a position to embrace this influx of people as an economic resource. Urban planners saw a chance to absorb the capital, skills, and entrepreneurship brought by new immigrants into the very fabric of the city. It was essentially this wave of immigration that enabled Hong Kong to shift from a simple trading port to a manufacturing powerhouse. If you compare this to a city like New York, where decades of immigration fueled both industrialization and finance, the parallels are clear. Hong Kong shielded Chinese refugees from communist policies, much like New York offered escape from European atrocities and war. Economically, both cities attracted the ambitious. Hong Kong through low taxes and free markets under British rule. New York through the promise of the American dream. See, British planners had designed Hong Kong to be a trade engine, not a traditional settler colony, but a hub for commerce, capital, and trade. They implemented minimal interference policies like free markets, low taxes, and limited regulation. This is what created a laissez-faire economy, a kind of hands-off capitalism that aligned with Britain's broader imperial trade ambitions. Of course, as time went by, Hong Kong modernized quite a bit. But if we're to look at the economic rise of Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, the 3 other countries of what became known as the 4 Asian Tigers due to their aggressive economic growth, Hong Kong didn't quite follow the same model. Unlike the others, Hong Kong never adopted a state-led approach to industrial development. On paper, it looked like textbook laissez-faire, low taxes, no capital controls, and almost no government debt. But the reality was a lot more complicated. From 1951 to 1971, Hong Kong's financial secretary John Cowperthwaite advocated for a policy known as positive non-interventionism, the belief that trying to steer or plan an open economy often does more harm than good. It was a deliberate choice to let market forces lead, while still guiding the city through targeted investments in housing, infrastructure, and education. It was a bold approach, and it worked. In 1950, Hong Kong's per capita income was less than 30% of Britain's, but by 1997, it had caught up. Today, it's around 40% higher, on par with the United States and Switzerland. For all its differences, Hong Kong has still emerged as a global finance hub, often going head-to-head with Singapore in a rivalry that continues today for the title of Financial Capital of Asia. By 1965, 29 foreign banks had opened branches in Hong Kong, including major players like HSBC and Standard Chartered, along with 8 branches of Chinese state banks. It was the 7th largest port in the world by the late 20th century, second only to New York City and Rotterdam in terms of container throughput. It was during this time period that it made the most progress. Stability became the priority, and in 1983, the government pegged the Hong Kong dollar to the US dollar. As a result, the peg reassured businesses, gave investors confidence, and became the foundation of Hong Kong's economic identity. Today, its stock exchange is the 5th largest in the world, with a market capitalization of more than $6 trillion. One other major part of it was that in 1973, the first modern skyscrapers began rising in Hong Kong's central district, the beating heart of the city. This is what made Hong Kong look and feel like a global financial center. And if you were to compare it to New York City in the early 20th century, with its rapid vertical growth in Manhattan, the logic was similar. Wall Street quickly became recognizable as the city's financial hub, as iconic high-rises like the 1914 JP Morgan & Co. building created a skyline that came to symbolize global finance itself. Today, Hong Kong has more skyscrapers than any city on Earth, with over 550 buildings taller than 490 feet, while New York City has only 320. But all of this financial freedom couldn't disguise the truth that Hong Kong was a borrowed place living on borrowed time. By the early 1980s, concerns about the future of Hong Kong began to resurface as the 1997 expiration date of the New Territories Agreement drew closer. Property developers worried about lease renewals, investors feared political uncertainty would erode market confidence, and bankers questioned whether long-term loans could still be issued with a ticking clock on the city's legal status. So, something had to be done to reassure the markets. In 1984, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It promised that Hong Kong would still return to China in 1997, but under a one-country, two-systems model for 50 years. It was capitalism under Chinese rule. And so, at midnight on July 1, 1997, Britain officially handed Hong Kong back to China. It became a special administrative region with its own legal system, mini-constitution, and certain civil liberties, like freedom of speech, protected under its basic law. Well, at least in theory. This all plays into why Hong Kong is still very much a global financial city. It's always playing the middleman. By serving as the intermediary between mainland China and the rest of the world, Hong Kong continues to offer financial services and handle international trade, all under a legal system modeled after the British one, which most other countries see as offering stronger legal protections in case of disputes. China is now the world's second largest economy, and with that growth has come the rise of companies like Huawei, Alibaba, and Tencent. But while these firms operate on a global scale, China's financial system doesn't. Strict capital controls prevent money from freely moving in and out of the mainland, making it more difficult for Chinese companies to raise foreign capital or operate internationally. This is where Hong Kong comes in. Operating under a separate financial and legal system, Hong Kong serves as China's gateway to the global capital markets, allowing Chinese firms to raise international funding and do business abroad without opening the mainland's tightly controlled financial system. Finally, we can't talk about the modern development of Hong Kong without mentioning the erosion of its political autonomy. See, ever since the 1997 handover, the promise of one country, two systems was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong its own legal and economic framework, separate from mainland China. And for a while, life appeared to continue more or less as promised. But that soon started to change. In 2014, Beijing announced that any candidates running for Hong Kong's top leadership role would have to be pre-approved by the central government. The decision sparked what became known as the Umbrella Movement. Tens of thousands of protesters, many of them students, took to the streets, demanding real democratic reform. They used umbrellas to shield themselves from police tear gas, and the symbol stuck. Then, in 2019, it all came to a head. A proposed extradition bill would allow criminal suspects in Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China, raising fears that people could be tried in a court system controlled by the Communist Party. For many, this was the end of Hong Kong's judicial independence, and with it, its autonomy. Over 2 million people flooded the streets in what became the largest protest in the city's history. But of course, the police have never confirmed this number. In 2020, a new national security law was imposed on Hong Kong, dramatically reshaping the city's relationship with the international community. The law criminalizes these 4 main types of activity. Each of these crimes carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. As a result, Hong Kong's comparative advantage in Asia, its legal distinctiveness, autonomy, and global trust no longer felt guaranteed. For 25 consecutive years, from 1995 to 2019, Hong Kong was ranked the world's most free economy by the Index of Economic Freedom. But now that era was over. Foreign investors and companies began looking elsewhere, turning their attention to Hong Kong's main regional rival, Singapore. Banks and consulting firms began relocating staff there to handle politically sensitive work like assessing the mainland Chinese economy. Seen as more stable, predictable, and politically neutral, Singapore quickly became the preferred alternative to the growing uncertainty in Hong Kong. Following the implementation of the national security law, the US announced it would no longer recognize Hong Kong as a separate customs territory. The UK, Canada, Australia, and several other countries have followed suit and successfully suspended the relevant preferential tariff agreements with Hong Kong. But the other part of this is its financial guarantees. These were once what set Hong Kong apart. But as political instability has risen, so too has the erosion of its financial autonomy. Let me explain. In 2022, for the first time in at least 3 decades, mainland Chinese companies with regional headquarters in Hong Kong outnumbered American ones, and the gap only widened in 2023. Mainland firms have also solidified their dominance in the city's stock market, taking up 80% of the market's total value by the end of October, compared with 60% a decade ago. As a result, Hong Kong is slowly becoming less global and more Chinese. There is a culture of uncertainty over Hong Kong's future, and it's reflected in how the city feels too. A compact city of 7.5 million that has almost no developable land left. Some districts have even reached up to 90,000 people per square mile, which is over 30% denser than Manhattan. It feels like you're living stacked on top of each other. Add that to some of the most expensive real estate in the world, and the pressure is hard to ignore. What this has all led to is Hong Kong holding on to its spot as Asia's top financial center, which is an extraordinary feat given the circumstances. The way New York is for North America and London is for Europe, Hong Kong is for Asia. And even as regional rivals like Singapore rise with innovation and tech, Hong Kong still leads in finance, trade, and global connectivity. But with the future still so uncertain, how long can it hold on to that title? I guess we'll have to see. Thank you for watching.